Hi everyone, I am Overthink podcast co-host Dr. David Peña-Guzmán.
And I'm co-host Dr. Ellie Anderson. Today we are really excited to talk with Dr. Raphaël Millière, who is the Presidential Scholar of Society and Neuroscience at Columbia University, about his work in AI.
Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So Raphael, you recently wrote an article based on your research for Wired magazine entitled AI Art is Challenging the Boundaries of Curation, which is about the relationship between new AI protocols like DALL, for example, and just our understanding of what it means to be an artist, who is an artist, so on and so forth. And I will want us to talk about that, but can you tell us first a little bit about how art works in the world of AI for the uninitiated like us?
Of course. So there is, first of all, I have said that AI has made great strides in the past 10 years because of this new development called deep learning. So this is this new class of algorithms, computer programs, that can learn from a lot of data kind of automatically, so from the bottom up. So you feed them data, you can collect a data set, and then they can learn by themselves to do certain things, to accomplish certain tasks. As far as the algorithms that are used for artistic purposes are concerned, these are algorithms that are generative. So they are generating new pieces of text or images or audio or videos, for example. And to do that, they get trained on data, and they get trained in such a way that they are trying to reproduce some of the features that are in the data sets, including to create novel outputs. So for example, in the case of image generation algorithms, these are the algorithms that are typically used by people to create visual outputs that then can be deemed having artistic value. These are algorithms that typically get trained on a data set composed of images and their captions. So you can scrape these images from the internet. So just take the public internet and just grab a bunch of images. And on the internet often you will have images that have captions, for example, for accessibility purposes. And the captions describe what's going on in the image, right? And so what you can do is ask your algorithm, can you try to guess which caption and which image go together? Try to find relationships between the text of the captions and the visual features of the images. And if you do that enough times with data sets composed of hundreds of millions, or in some cases billions of images and captions, eventually your algorithm is going to become very good at putting together the right images with the right captions. And then you can, once your algorithm is trained in that way and becomes very good at that, you can kind of reverse the process once it's trained in the phase we call inference, which is when you generate the new things. And for that, you can feed a little bit of text to your algorithm that looks a little bit like a caption that describes a certain image. And then the algorithm will be able to produce a whole new image that is the algorithm's best guess as to which kind of image would fit that particular caption. And so that's the generative text-to-image process. You feed it a prompt, we call it, so a piece of text that describes the desired output, and then the algorithm will generate a corresponding image. And this is one of the main categories of algorithms people use for artistic purposes, because a lot of the people who operate in the realm of AI art are visual artists, and they use these new algorithms to generate images and create visual artworks. And that raises all sorts of fascinating questions. I'm sure we'll get into it.
Totally. Well, and it also, I think that helps me understand or put into perspective something that I guess should have been obvious to me, but that wasn't really, which is why so many of these AI images look like composites. You know, like I feel like, especially with faces, sometimes you'll see these AI generated images that look like sort of bizarre composites of different elements of the face. I certainly think probably what immediately comes up for a lot of people, including myself, is questions about what this means for human artists, like in the labor market, like whose images are getting scraped. Maybe we can come back to that a little bit later, but I just wanted to flag that I think is of interest to me. But I'm curious where you see creation fitting in here, because I think when I hear about the debates about AI art, a lot of them have to do with whether the AI is creating the art or not. And I mean, you have, I know, thoughts on not only this, but also what the role of the person who's putting in the prompts has as like, is this person an artist in the sense we usually think about it?
Right. Yeah. So one thing that I think is important to have in mind is that there is a really deep sense in which these algorithms are not autonomous, right? So, and that's important when we discuss questions such as, are these algorithms artists themselves, right? So, essentially, you need a human in the loop in order to produce any of these images, because you need a human to input the prompt to the algorithm at a minimum and to generate an image. But generally, the process that leads to the creation of images that are, offered as artistic works in the realm of AI art is more complicated. So it's not just putting a text prompt and then clicking a button. But even more generally, even in the most minimal case where you're just giving a description of an image, say, a portrait of a cat sitting on a mat, so you're giving a text description is generating a picture on the basis of that description, and you might think, well, that's very, it's a very lazy process. You're just clicking a button. You don't need any particular artistic skill. But it's interesting because this kind of debate has, a very similar debate was going on when photography was invented, right?
Yeah.
And there was a lot of pushback, and with the artists, publishing, the equivalent of op-eds at the time, essays in magazines, and saying, this will never be art. At best, it's an attempt at archiving reality, but it will never be anything like art because it's just pressing a button. And I think we've moved past that because we, all of us in our pockets these days, we have a miniature camera from a smartphone. I don't think that automatically makes all of us artists, right?
Yeah.
And I think we can all agree on that. So the mere ability to press the button is not making us artists.
Good.
And so in order to be an AI artist, or an artist, as I prefer to say, using AI as a tool in their artistic toolkit and in their artistic process, you presumably need more than just access to these algorithms that are increasingly easy to use, and you need in particular, perhaps a vision, inspiration, talent, and new kinds of skills that come with crafting specific prompts that can accomplish specific results. So I think sometimes people have flippant reactions to this debate about AI art that don't take into account the fact that just having the ability to create any kind of image with an algorithm like this doesn't make everyone an artist.
So let me ask you a question about this, because when I've talked to people about DALL-E and then there was DALL-E 2, I actually don't know if there's still open access at the moment or not.
Yes.
Okay. So one of the questions that I have is, when somebody puts in a prompt, do you know if I put in the same prompt back to back, will it generate the same image?
No, so it's stochastic. So there is some degree of indeterminacy in the generation of the images. Yeah.
Okay, and so I'm going to try to push back and put on my hat of the 19th century critic of photography, transposed onto the 21st century. Because I think one argument that could be made that would redeem photography, but then poses a challenge for AI art, is that at least in the case of photography, we can articulate a case for the dependence of the final product on the action of the individual in such a way that it could not have happened without the individual, and the same set of actions by the individual at the same moment would have led to the same result, so that there's a kind of codependence of product and producer. And the stochastic nature of the algorithm sort of throws a little bit of a wrench into maybe that articulation of the relationship between the two, because it would mean that maybe the creative power doesn't lie, or at least doesn't lie exclusively in the side of the artist. If anything, it might be the algorithm that adds that creative stochastic element. Or if we wanted to push it back a little bit in a different direction, we could say, well, it's not the algorithm, but the coders of the algorithm that are the real artists. And so I'm curious about that. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, so I think essentially that's a question about how much control the artist has over the output. And I think you can raise similar concerns or points about photography, right? So many photographers say those who are not working with the studio and with a carefully composed scene will perhaps go out in the streets and take snapshots of things they see. they don't have full control over what's happening, right? And there might be that someone, like maybe a cyclist suddenly, passes through the shot and gets captured, as part of the scene, and that's maybe a happy accident that leads to a particular photograph that we deem, very interesting. There are many famous examples in the history of photography of this kind of haphazard events that lead to a particularly interesting shot, and it's not like this was under the control of the photographer in any robust sense. So I think this element of stochasticity, you can find it also in photography, even though it's not on the side of the parameters of the camera, but on the side of what's happening in the scene. So there are some respects in which perhaps the AI artists using an image generation algorithm might have less control than the photographer because of this stochastic element. There are other aspects in which they might have more control, in the sense of the stochasticity is not coming from the external world in this way. That said, there are also techniques to reduce the stochastic element. So, for example, the stochasticity comes from the fact that when you generate an image, the model, the algorithm, is using what's known as a random seed to generate any particular image. You can actually make the image reproducible if you use a determinate seed, so a specific number that is seeding the initial noise added to produce the image. Without getting into the technical details, it is possible to make it deterministic, so keeping the parameters fixed such that the very same prompt with the very same model will result in the very same image. Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it seems fair to say that on your view, you don't think that the algorithm is an artist.
Mm-hmm.
And it also seems fair to say that you think the prompter may or may not be an artist, in the same way that I may or may not be an artist when I'm taking a photo with my camera. Do you think that in the future that might change and we might get to a point at which artificial intelligence is becoming an artist?
I think that would take a very drastic change in the way these algorithms work.
Okay.
So one thing I would like to flag perhaps is that, sometimes people ask me, do you think these algorithms are creative? And I think there are two different ways in which we could parse that question, right? So there is a more deflationary sense of creativity or originality, in which you might say, yes, these algorithms are creative in the sense that, and that goes back to your earlier comments about the composite nature of these images. That can be a little bit misleading, because sometimes people think that all these algorithms are doing is just taking some of the samples from the training data, so for example artworks that have been created by humans, and doing a kind of collage, just taking a head from there and maybe like a body from there, and putting them together and kind of plagiarizing different artworks from the training data and putting them together. What they're actually doing is more sophisticated. So in the limit, you will have some edge cases in which indeed they might produce images that look very similar to images from the training data, but most of the time they are capable of creating genuinely novel outputs that don't really look like any of the specific outputs they've been trained on. So they're capable of generalizing beyond the specific distribution of the training sample. In the same way, text generation algorithm, language models, or chatbots like ChatGPT can create totally novel sentences that you've never seen before. There's an example from GPT-4 when it was released, and showing that it could generate a poem about explaining a particular section of the tax system in the US in the style of a Shakespearean parrot. And it can do so very well, right? In iambic pentameters, using like parrot terminology and then explaining. So that's clearly something it's never seen before. So they have this creativity in this weak sense. Now, when we talk about creativity in humans, we generally assume that it comes with something more, which is intentions to realize a particular vision, for example, for an artist, right? So we have intentions, goals, intrinsic goals that lead an artist to approach an artwork in a certain way, to draw things in a particular way, and so on. These algorithms, in my opinion, don't have anything like intrinsic goals in that sense. They don't have any desire, they don't have any vision, artistic vision, or otherwise they don't have any intention in that sense. And so that's why I would be very reluctant to say that any of these algorithms are artists. Maybe in the future you might have more autonomous algorithms that could genuinely form their own intentions to create something, generally have their own artistic vision. It seems like it would take a much richer kind of set of psychological capacities than current algorithms have, and essentially would take something like a more general and human-like form of intelligence that we are still, in my opinion, quite far away from.
Yeah. So when I think about one of the main challenges that people pose or that people see in the development of AI is precisely that lack of intention that is tied to the myth of the genius and the artist, the one who produces sort of from the depths of their being and generates something new. And the argument typically, especially when it comes to AI, is that because this is all sort of machinic and computational, you just cannot have that. And now I'm going to go in the other direction in this question because there is a whole tradition of automatism in art. You know, it's there in literature of people who have tried to write texts that are freed from any kind of subjective conscious control, where you know, type as fast as you can so that something automatic kicks in. And, you know, we recognize that as art. That's been replicated in drawing, that's been replicated in painting. And so I'm wondering whether, like, this is sort of a new version of that. And so maybe the real challenge, and this is where I'm heading, maybe the real challenge is not so much that it's automated or machinic or computational. Maybe the real challenge in the case of AI art is that it distributes the category of the artist in a way that we haven't really had before. Because with previously automated art, you still can identify, like, the person doing that, like the, you know, Pollock trying to, like, spread paint on the canvas. There's still an individual. But here, you have multiple individuals. You have the person putting in the prompt. You have all the people who coded the algorithm. And so it's kind of unclear where the locus of production is.
Can I just add a couple quick points to that? So one is, I think with respect to the myth of the genius, already the story is kind of complicated because in some of the main theories of genius, for instance, Kant's theory of genius, you already have this idea that the genius is overtaken by something beyond them that is outside of them. So I might even say that there it's like a bit more complicated. But I would also say I think this idea of the distribution of art is new with respect to painting and this image generation, but it's not new with respect to other arts. For instance, theater and film are already distributed styles of art. Anyway, that was just like to jump in, but back to David's question.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. There's a lot there. So you're absolutely right, and this is usually what I bring up right after I say that. You know, these machines like intentions. That is true. Many artists, you talk to them, and they will tell you, well, actually, I don't, you know, go to my canvas having a particular vision in mind or, you know, forming in this very procedural way a certain intention and then realizing it, but it just kind of happens. And and a lot of artists working with AI algorithms will themselves be very happy to say things like, I collaborate with the algorithm or things like that, that perhaps we philosophers are a bit more reluctant to say. So it's interesting that it seems like, you know, artists have perhaps a less, you know, romanticized view of the artistic process and the creative intentions that go into it that sometimes we do. But I would still say, though, to push back on this, that well, first of all, there's a long tradition of generative art in the 20th history of art that even predates the invention of computers, where you would have things like, you know, artists putting a canvas in the forest and letting the elements, you know, do their work. And then it's a process that is much more impersonal in some sense and less intention-driven than the typical process of artistic creation. And nonetheless, I think it is still art that is made by humans for humans in a very substantial sense, right? So there is still, even though, you know, there is an intention to not project any particular human intention, as it were. So it's like a meta intention to put the canvas in the forest and just have the elements, work on that canvas and then exhibit it in the museum. Or, you know, you can think of the ready-mades from Duchamp and so on, right? So even then, I think the human intention is still important, even though the process of the specific process of creation with the canvas, for example, or the object that's taken from a shop to put in a museum is something that perhaps was not imbued with an artistic intention. And the object of the artwork is also produced for human consumption. I don't really like that term, but like for the enjoyment of other humans. And I think that's still the case with AI algorithms, where humans use these algorithms as tools to produce artworks that are destined for other humans. With respect to your point about the distribution of artistry or artistic authorship, as it were, I think it's tricky because you could, I think this point might overgeneralize to a lot of other things. So you could say, why stop there? Why not think that the Fujifilm engineers that created your camera should be credited as well with, a particular photograph that you've taken, or the people who made the brush that you're using, the paintbrush to create a painting. These are tools. I mean, they are new tools, but it seems to me that we ought to be careful not to overgeneralize descriptions of artistic authorship, just because there are people, engineers involved in creating these algorithms, but again, the algorithm is learning from the data set, and these engineers are not themselves by hand making artistic decisions about specific features that the algorithms should represent more than others.
Yeah. So I think this is a perfect place then to ask the labor question. I think this should probably be our last question, although I'm sure we could talk to you all day. But I think there's obviously been a lot of concern among artists in terms of the fact that these images are getting scraped off of the internet by the algorithm and ultimately by the engineers. So there's a potential exploitation argument to be made. And so that, I think, relates to the idea of artists' existing work. So it's a sort of past, or it's a question about how we in the present and future relate to the past. But I also think there's a labor question towards the future, which is how are artists in the future going to interact with these AI? And I was at an event a couple of months ago where somebody was talking. It was like one of somebody who works for, what's the company that does DALL and ChatGPT?
OpenAI.
Yeah. It was like one of the engineers for OpenAI talking about how DALL was already changing animation studios and the way that animators are iterating on different possibilities for scenes. And that seems like it could really open up human creativity in exciting new ways by allowing us like certain shortcuts. So I'm curious like what you think about that sort of exploitation question with respect to scraping existing images from the internet, and also like whether you're optimistic about the future for artists.
Yeah, thank you. That's also a very thorny question. I think there are legal ramifications, moral ramifications. The copyright question from a legal perspective hasn't been settled yet. So there are ongoing lawsuits, and the next few years will be very interesting. Mm-hmm. Both because traditionally, scraping data from the internet was considered fair use, but also because traditionally the outputs of algorithms was deemed not copyrightable, right? So like there's the question about whether there's a question about the protection of the copyright of artists on which the data is scraped on. There's also a question of the protection of the copyrights of artists who are using AI to create artworks, right?
Yes.
It's very complicated. I think what's interesting to me is that there is this really blurry boundary in the art world between plagiarism, pastiche, and homage, right? So there's a long, copyright is a modern Western concept, and there is a long history of artists, riffing off each other, imitating each other, paying homage to each other. I mean, a lot of artists famously, Picasso has this whole series of imitating the great masters. I remember many years ago, there was a great exhibition in Paris precisely on that. And when we look at that, we think of it as a form of homage, and really, not something that's morally reprehensible. But there is a fine line, and all the artists that work within a certain movement, artistic movement, for example, the Impressionists or the Cubists, well, you could say, there is perhaps one artist that is the true pioneer that really is the first to create that artistic style, and then all of the others are just copying that style, and maybe adding a few tweaks here and there. But of course, we don't really see it that way, or we don't think of this as theft of intellectual property. And human artists, they also learn from exposure to other artworks. A bit like these algorithms learn, we get exposed to a kind of data set of artworks just by studying in art school and so on, and going to museums, and we use these inspirations in creation. And so So it's very tricky to exactly pinpoint where, to draw the line. Where does it become plagiarism? Where does it actually infringes on copyright? And where does it become immoral, for example?
Yeah.
That said, my personal view is that I think there should be a blanket option for artists to at least opt out of scraping. So there is already a mechanism in place, for example, for web pages. If you don't want your web page to be scraped, you can add a file on your website that is traditionally named robot.txt. So it's just a text file that says to any automatic scraper that scrapes web pages, do not scrape.
We need to figure out how to do this for our website.
No, it's okay. People can scrape us. That's fine. You can plagiarize us. You can copy us.
Oh
it's
my
all
god,
good.
I do not sanction that. Anyway.
So I think we probably need some kind of standard formats for that can be embedded in an image in the metadata that says do not scrape or do not use to train an AI model. Mm-hmm. Right, and then beyond that, with respect to the other part of your question, I do think it's really lowering the barrier to entry to artistic creation in a way that is a bit reminiscent of how photography or photo cameras have done so as well. Many people who were not particularly talented with a paintbrush were able to express themselves in a different way using a camera, but it's not just. I would say it's complicated because it's not just lowering the barrier to entry, it's also creating a new kind of skill or skill set, right? So being a photographer, it's not just being lazy and pressing a button. There's actually a whole new skill set about framing, composition, exposure, balance, and so on, that comes into play. And these algorithms, similarly, you can use them in a very kind of, just take an off-the-shelf algorithm or use DALL, press a button, but most of the time that's not going to lead to something very interesting. It's kind of this generic output that we've seen a million times. That's really not very appealing. The AI artists that I found most interesting are people who actually tinker a lot. They have a very complicated process. They sometimes train their own algorithms, or they have they have a really tremendous skill set that is highly non-trivial. But I do think it will. So I think it will transform art a little bit like photography transformed art, but not only transform art by creating new media for artistic creation, but also in return maybe changing traditional media. So, for example, photography has had a really tremendous indirect influence on painting because realistic paintings were not as appealing anymore. You could just use a camera. It's like, if you're going to do that, what's the point? So you might, as well create a more abstract painting and explore that more abstract realm. And I don't know yet what kind of similar influence AI art will have, but I would venture it will have similar effects on other traditional media.
Fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. I'm just one tiny final question because it's been bugging me. When you talk about the skill that people develop for producing a prompt, and this is a very technical question, is it that you can just add more information to the prompt to add more details that you want reflected in the final product? Or are there other things that you can do in interacting, for example, with DALL other than the prompt that I don't know about? Is it all about just the prompt, or are there other mechanisms for influencing it?
Right. So with DALL, because it's a service offered by OpenAI that is closed source, so there is no way to tinker with the algorithm beyond just inputting a prompt. It's what people call an API. It's a platform. There's very little you can do beyond the prompt. But there are a lot of other algorithms that people can use for image generation, especially if you're a bit more technically savvy, where you have a host of different parameters that you can adjust. And you can also tinker, people create plugins that code to act on different in different parts of the process of the creation of the image, and you can do very complex things. But even just tinkering with the prompt, if you talk to people who are experienced with prompting this algorithm, they will tell you it's a bit like an incantation. You have to really get a feel for what kind of word will have what different kinds of effects, and it's highly non-trivial. So different algorithms are opinionated in different ways. A bit like when if you talk to photographers, they each have their favorite brand of camera. They have different color profiles, different color science behind it. It's a bit like that as well. And so people end up acquiring specific knowledge about how to prompt, how to whisper in the ear of certain algorithms to obtain certain interesting results. And it's really not just a matter of just, inputting a a very generic description of a certain scene, you learn to put the word in the right order, put the emphasis in the right way, and so on to generate specific results.
Well,
Great.
Raphaël, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute delight, hearing you talk about your expertise, and I'm sure that our overthinkers feel the same way.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.